The sudden severing of digital communication is not an expression of calculated emotional indifference, but a physiological panic response triggered by acute cognitive overload within the human brain. When an individual chooses sudden disappearance over an explicit breakup conversation, their sympathetic nervous system has already processed the impending confrontation as an intolerable biological threat. This immediate behavioral collapse reveals that ghosting psychology is fundamentally governed by survival mechanics, where the brain prioritizes immediate self-preservation over complex moral reasoning and interpersonal responsibility.
The absence of physical object constancy in adult attachment networks creates severe vulnerabilities in personal accountability and emotional permanence. For individuals who exhibit high covert narcissistic traits or immature coping strategies, out of sight literally translates to out of mind on a subconscious operational level. Once physical contact is terminated, the partner's emotional state ceases to exist as a real-time concern, allowing the ghoster to resume daily functioning without internal consequence. Emotional flooding causes a profound biochemical shutdown within the brain's executive functioning centers during micro-confrontations. When an individual feels utterly incapable of regulating their internal state during hard discussions, the amygdala hijacks the decision-making pipeline, perceiving open dialogue as an existential trap. In this heightened state of alarm, vanishing without a trace becomes the only viable path to restoring internal homeostatic balance. Modern relationship dynamics have converted biological attachment bonds into disposable microtransactions through extreme digital frictionlessness. The perceived necessity of enduring the painful physiological burden of an explicit breakup speech diminishes when modern technology offers an effortless escape route. Digital platforms provide an unprecedented psychological buffer, allowing users to terminate complex social contracts without enduring the physical, visceral reactions of their counterpart. Toxic shame acts as a silent catalyst behind the decision to abruptly vanish from another person's life without explanation. Unlike healthy guilt, which motivates corrective action and open communication, profound shame convinces the individual that their internal flaws are irredeemable and exposed. Confronting a partner directly forces the individual to stare into the mirror of their own emotional inadequacy, driving them to retreat into complete psychological isolation. Modern dating platforms actively condition the human brain to treat potential partners as replaceable sensory inputs rather than distinct emotional entities. This systemic gamification triggers dopamine spikes during initial acquisition, but severely degrades long-term empathy when the novelty inevitably decays over time. When emotional investment declines, the cognitive expenditure required to conduct an explicit breakup feels disproportionately high, incentivizing instant retreat over respectful termination. Power dynamics in ghosting psychology are fundamentally anchored in maintaining absolute unilateral control over the narrative closure. By withholding explanation, the ghoster exerts an asymmetric psychological dominance, forcing the abandoned partner into an endless loop of self-doubt and overanalysis. This forced ambiguity leaves the victim trapped in unresolved grief, while the perpetrator retains complete insulation from emotional accountability. Developmental trauma often weaponizes adult communication pathways, causing mature individuals to revert to childhood survival mechanisms during relationship strain. Early environments where self-expression resulted in emotional danger condition the adult brain to view open conflict as an immediate survival hazard. When direct dialogue was historically paired with volatile punishment, total retreat becomes the brain's default, automated survival algorithm.
Chronic conflict phobia severely restricts an individual's emotional bandwidth, making honest dialogue feel like a catastrophic event. Individuals suffering from deep-seated interpersonal anxiety perceive any form of disappointment or direct breakups as an unmanageable existential crisis. Consequently, they view sudden disappearance not as a malicious betrayal, but as a mandatory act of self-preservation in the face of perceived emotional annihilation. The neurological concept of rejection sensitivity dysphoria plays a massive role in driving extreme avoidance behaviors during breakups. Individuals with heightened rejection sensitivity experience anticipated social disapproval as an overwhelming physical crushing sensation within their nervous system. To protect themselves from this unbearable internal agony, they preemptively sever all connection, choosing to ghost before they can be held accountable. Low emotional intelligence severely limits a person's ability to navigate complex interpersonal negotiations and articulated breakups. When an individual lacks the introspective vocabulary to explain their shifting internal feelings, they experience severe frustration and intellectual paralysis. Deprived of the cognitive tools to formulate a coherent end-of-relationship narrative, they resort to absolute silence as their sole remaining communication strategy. Subconscious punitive mechanics often transform unexplained silence into an intentional instrument of psychological control and passive aggression. By denying the partner explicit closure, the ghoster effectively weaponizes absence, ensuring their permanent installation within the victim's subconscious mind. This calculated or unconscious withholding transforms the sudden departure into an indelible psychological scar that forever alters the victim's trust framework. Sympathetic nervous system hyperarousal during conflict triggers an immediate fight, flight, or freeze reaction in fragile personalities. When faced with a severe physiological stress of ending a relationship, the flight and freeze responses dominate, completely paralyzing the brain's linguistic centers. The individual becomes incapable of producing coherent speech or confronting the immediate emotional aftermath, rendering sudden disappearance the path of least biological resistance. Parasocial tendencies and digital disinhibition have fundamentally altered how modern society measures interpersonal obligation and respect. In an era where human connections are initiated with a swipe, the perceived social cost of dissolving those connections approaches zero. This artificial low-stakes environment fosters a culture where ending a relationship directly is viewed as an unnecessary high-risk operational expenditure. The covert narcissist relies on sudden disappearance as a precise tool to shield their fragile ego from damage and criticism. Confronting a partner during a breakup risks receiving negative feedback, critique, or exposed flaws, which would shatter their artificial self-concept. By vanishing instantly, they seal their ego within an impenetrable vault, completely protected from any external critique or emotional fallout. Cognitive rupture occurs when the human mind is forced to process the profound paradox of immediate emotional erasure from someone they trusted. This intense psychological fracture forces the victim to question their own perception of reality, generating severe hypervigilance in future social interactions. The ghoster's refusal to speak leaves an open emotional wound that requires months of complex cognitive restructuring to heal. Deconstructive psychological defense mechanisms allow individuals to compartmentalize their behavior and block out moral responsibility entirely. Through a process of selective moral disengagement, the ghoster convinces themselves that their former partner will quickly move on without long-term issue. This delusional reframing minimizes internal moral tension, allowing the ghoster to walk away without experiencing severe self-condemnation. Sociocultural normalization of ghosting has lowered the moral boundary required to abandon long-term relationships without communication. As digital culture increasingly jokes about or normalizes sudden disappearances, the collective social shame once associated with cowardly breakups has eroded. This cultural shift provides conflict-averse individuals with implicit permission to choose personal convenience over basic human decency. High Machiavellian traits lead individuals to perform calculated cost-benefit analyses on every human interaction they engage in.
Once a partner no longer yields strategic, emotional, or social utility, the Machiavellian brain views further communication as an unproductive expenditure of energy. Consequently, total ghosting becomes the most efficient, cost-effective method for closing an obsolete emotional account. Attachment security suffers catastrophic failure when the ultimate boundary violation is executed without a single word of warning. The sudden, unexplained disappearance of a trusted partner triggers an existential threat response in the victim's brain, dismantling their foundational assumptions of relational safety. This deep trauma response reframes all future intimacy as an imminent threat, permanently conditioning the mind for abandonment. Oxytocin withdrawal following abrupt relationship termination induces actual physical withdrawal symptoms within the human brain. When a partner suddenly vanishes without warning or closure, the abandoned individual's neural circuits experience a sharp, agonizing crash in dopamine and serotonin levels. This sudden neurochemical plummet plunges the victim into a state of acute somatic distress, identical to clinical substance withdrawal. Internalized fear of emotional vulnerability prevents fragile personalities from engaging in real, honest breakups. Expressing true feelings requires dropping emotional armor and exposing vulnerable internal states to another human being. To avoid this frightening level of exposure, the ghoster chooses total retreat, keeping their protective armor fully intact, while sacrificing the partner's emotional stability. Pathological conflict avoidance inevitably leads to the total degradation of an individual's moral character over time. Every time a person chooses to ghost instead of facing the uncomfortable truth of a direct breakup, they reinforce a neural loop of cowardice. This repeated behavior entrenches avoidance as their primary coping mechanism, ensuring they remain forever capable of sustained, mature intimacy.
Emotional maturity requires the fundamental capacity to endure short-term personal discomfort for another person's long-term peace. When an individual prioritizes their immediate physiological comfort over their partner's need for closure, they reveal the profound emptiness of their psychological capacity. Real human connection demands that we face the painful reality of direct goodbye, rather than cowardly dissolving into thin air. The neurological legacy of ghosting extends far beyond the immediate moment of social media blockage or complete silence. The ghoster's decision to choose safety over truth creates a lasting psychological pattern that destroys future relational dynamics. By failing to master the critical skill of direct termination, they condemn themselves to a perpetual cycle of superficial connections and inevitable escapes. Understanding the deep behavioral mechanics of ghosting psychology strips away the illusion of mystery behind sudden disappearance. It reveals that ghosting is rarely about the victim's worth, but rather a reflection of the ghoster's internal emotional bankruptcy and severe fear of conflict. Recognizing this scientific reality empowers victims to reclaim their narrative, shifting the burden of shame back to the true perpetrator. Ultimate behavioral analysis demonstrates that the decision to vanish is a complete failure of emotional self-regulation and human empathy. Silence is not an absence of sound, but an explicit declaration of psychological cowardice that forever defines the character of the one who runs away. True power lies not in escaping the storm of direct confrontation, but in having the courage to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be.